Chad Scott for Rovology.com from the Castillo de San Marcos, and most people will recognize this certainly by the name and associate it with Spanish colonial history, and that is true. That is true, but there's a lot more here, a more important story, in my opinion, to be told. This masonry fort built in 1695 by the Spanish as they were attempting to colonize America. Remember this, Florida was not part of the United States until 1821. Okay, 1821. The American Revolution, of course, 1776. So that was a long time after the American Revolution. Florida was not one of the original colonies like Georgia or South Carolina was. St. Augustine, a popular tourist destination. I'll loop you around here because the historic district is right there. And that's where most people are going to go. That's where all the shops and the restaurants and the galleries are. We see the Matanzas River right here. Beyond that will be the Atlantic Ocean. I am most interested in the Castillo de San Marcos when it went by another name, and that was after Florida became part of the United States. It was known as Fort Marion. Fort Marion is the origin of one of the most horrific periods in American history. Fort Marion was overseen by an Army officer named Richard Henry Pratt. Richard Henry Pratt is the father of the American Indian boarding school, because it was here at Fort Marion that 70 or so Kiowa, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, I believe, prisoners of war, soldiers, warriors from the Red River War, which was out in Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma. The Red River War ends. It was the Southern Plains tribes, Indians, opposing incursion by the U.S. federal government, the westward expansion, the westward push, colonization, manifest destiny. The native people out there were attempting to hold on to their land and keep the white European colonizers out. Lost that war, and the prisoners sent by rail and wound up here in the old Castillo de San Marcos, which had been renamed Fort Marion by the United States once Florida became part of the United States in 1821. Those prisoners of war, Native American, overseen by Richard Henry Pratt, were encouraged to create artwork. They brought their ledger art with them. There are thousands of pieces of ledger art drawn by the Native Americans imprisoned here as prisoners of war. They were provided with sketchbooks, ledgers, pencils by Pratt, and encouraged to draw their experiences during the Red River War, pre-contact with whites, and then what they experienced here. The St. Augustine Lighthouse is over there. Don't bother looking at it; it's too far. I can see it. You wouldn't pick it up in the camera. But they drew all of that while they were imprisoned here, and then Pratt sold those drawings in complete books or as separate pieces to tourists in St. Augustine, but he also sent them to governmental officials, because Pratt was, for the time, a progressive. Pratt said, you know, these Indians aren't so bad if you could just get the Indian out of them. If you could assimilate them into white culture, if you could break them of their spirituality, their religion, their language. They could be Americans. Kill the Indian, save the man. Kill the Indian, save the man. Richard Henry Pratt, that was his line. And he developed that philosophy right here when this was Fort Marion. And he sent these ledger books to important Northerners to say, hey, you know, we don't have to exterminate these people, we can assimilate these people. This was very progressive. This was considered humane at the time. Instead of just the outright murder of all native people, why don't we assimilate them? Why don't we try and make them white? We'll introduce them to private property. We'll introduce them to capitalism instead of their communal ways of living. We'll teach them Christianity. We will teach them English. We'll teach them how to farm and turn them into farmers instead of nomadic people following the bison for the Plains Indians. And his way of doing this was the Indian boarding school. Red River War ends in the late 70s. Indian boarding school era starts there and lasts for nearly the next 100 years. Indian boarding schools forcibly, the system as operated by both the church and the state, the federal government, forcibly removed Native American children from their homes against the wishes of their parents. They would pry them out of the hands of their parents. They would kidnap these children. The Native American children, the same thing happened in Canada. When you hear about the residential boarding schools, same thing, same system, same operating philosophy, same white supremacist mania. Native children were kidnapped from their families, taken out of their homes. They were sent to the boarding schools where they were stripped of their clothing, had their hair cut. They were dressed like white kids. They were beaten for speaking their languages, and they were forced to practice Christianity. These Indian boarding schools were hardly schools. They were more akin to boot camp, to be kind, military training, imprisonment, to perhaps be more accurate. Manual labor, menial labor, forced labor, torture, beatings, psychological abuse, physical abuse, oftentimes death. Sometimes they would never return to their families. If they did, you can imagine the emotional scars they would have. The Indian boarding schools, the idea for which came from that place right there. The Indian boarding schools were indoctrination camps. They attempted to kill the Indian and save the man. So when you hear about the Castillo de San Marcos, when you hear about St. Augustine, when you hear about generational trauma and how some wounds pass through generations, that's what we're talking about. That's what people are talking about right there. And that is the history I want you to remember if you visit St. Augustine and come here to the Castillo de San Marcos, formerly Fort Marion. I'll drop some links in the show notes for further reading on the Indian boarding schools and the Native American prisoners of war who were held here, and the ledger drawings that they created while here in St. Augustine. Chad Scott for Rovology.com.